A cop finds a freezing dog chained to a tree, barely clinging to life. With no one else around, he does the only thing he can. He rushes the dog to safety. But the moment he looks into her eyes, something inside him breaks. This isn't just any dog. She's got a past, one that no one expected, a connection to a lost family that's been hiding in plain sight. Who left her there to die? And why is this dog's survival tied to secrets buried long ago? What happens when the truth about her owner is revealed? Get ready for a heart-wrenching journey of redemption, family, and second chances in this life-changing story. Don't miss out on what happens next. This is a rescue that changes everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Through the windshield of his patrol car, Ben Holloway watched the relentless snow paint the small-town streets in layers of white. The clock on his dashboard read 8:52 p.m., and his shoulders sagged with the weight of his long shift. All he wanted was to get home, maybe heat up some leftover pizza, and fall into his bed. The radio crackled to life, breaking the quiet rhythm of his wipers against the glass. Unit 12, there's a report of distressed barking in the woods near the old abandoned property. No further details. Over. Ben's jaw tightened as he stared at the radio. He ran a tired hand over his face and pressed the button. Copy that, dispatch. I'm headed that way now. With a deep sigh, he turned the wheel, directing his car toward the outskirts of town. The engine hummed steadily as his tires crunched through the fresh snow. Street lights grew sparse, then disappeared altogether as he approached the wooded area. Just what I needed, he muttered to himself, squinting through the darkness. A wild goose chase in the middle of nowhere. The old abandoned property came into view, a decrepit house with broken windows and weathered siding, barely visible through the overgrown trees. Ben pulled up to the entrance and killed the engine. In the sudden silence, he heard it. Desperate, frightened barking coming from somewhere in the woods. Grabbing his heavy-duty flashlight, Ben stepped out of the warm car into the biting cold. His boots sank several inches into the snow as he made his way toward the sound. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, catching snowflakes in its path and creating eerie shadows among the trees. The barking grew louder, more frantic. Ben's training told him to remain detached, to treat this like any other call. But something about the desperation in those barks made his heart beat faster. He pushed through low-hanging branches, his breath visible in the freezing air. Then his flashlight beam landed on something that made him stop dead in his tracks. A German shepherd was chained to a large oak tree, its body partially covered in snow. The dog's ribs pressed against its skin like bars of a cage, and the chain around its neck had cut into the flesh. The animal was shivering violently, its eyes glazed with exhaustion and pain. "Jesus Christ," Ben whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The dog's eyes met his, deep brown eyes filled with such raw desperation that it shook something loose inside Ben's carefully maintained emotional walls. He'd seen plenty of terrible things in his years on the force, but this was different. Moving slowly, Ben approached the trembling animal. "Hey there," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm going to help you, okay?" The dog whimpered, but didn't growl or show any signs of aggression. Instead, it seemed to slump further, as if finally allowing itself to give up now that help had arrived. Ben's hands shook as he examined the chain. It was wrapped tight, cruelly tight, and the lock was nearly frozen shut. He worked at it with cold, numbed fingers, his anger building with each passing second. Who could do this? Who could chain up an animal and leave it to die in the freezing cold? Finally, the chain came loose. The dog slumped forward, and Ben caught it gently, cradling its weak body in his arms. He was surprised by how light it was. This beautiful animal had been starved nearly to death. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you now." The dog's cold nose pressed against his neck, and Ben felt tears stinging his eyes. He blinked them away quickly, but they kept coming. This wasn't like him. He didn't cry on the job, hadn't cried in years. But something about this dog's trust, its vulnerability, broke through his carefully constructed defenses. Moving as fast as he safely could through the snow, Ben carried the dog back to his patrol car. He laid it gently on the back seat and cranked up the heat. The nearest emergency vet clinic was 15 minutes away. If he hurried, maybe. Ben drove through the snowy streets with his lights flashing, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back occasionally to touch the dog's head, making sure it was still breathing. "Stay with me," he kept saying, his voice cracking. "Just stay with me." When he finally pulled up to the vet clinic, his face was wet with tears he couldn't explain. He gathered the dog in his arms again and burst through the front door. Dr. Collins, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and efficient movements, rushed forward immediately. "What do we have here?" "Found her chained to a tree," Ben managed to say, his arms trembling as he held the dog. "She's been out there for days, maybe longer." Dr. Collins took the German Shepherd from his arms, her experienced hands already assessing the situation. She looked up at Ben's tear-streaked face, her expression softening with understanding. "Let's see if we can save her," she said firmly, already moving toward the examination room. Ben stood in the lobby, his hands still shaking. He looked down at them, surprised to find them covered in the dog's fur and spots of blood from the chain wounds. The tough, detached officer who'd started his shift that morning was gone, replaced by someone who felt cracked open, raw, and inexplicably connected to a dog he'd just met. He sank into one of the hard plastic chairs, his heart pounding, with a fear he hadn't felt in years. The fear of caring too much, of letting something matter. But it was too late. That dog's eyes, that moment of trust when it had slumped into his arms, it had already changed something inside him, whether he wanted it to or not. Ben's boots left wet marks on the clinic's linoleum floor as he paced back and forth. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows in the empty waiting room. His police uniform was still damp from the snow, and melting flakes dripped from his coat onto the floor. Every time the door to the treatment area opened, his head snapped up, hoping for news about Daisy. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet space. 10:15 p.m. It had been over an hour since he'd brought her in. His hands still felt cold from carrying her frozen body, and he couldn't stop rubbing them together, trying to warm them up. The treatment room door swung open. Dr. Collins emerged, her face drawn and serious. Ben's stomach dropped as she approached him, pulling off her latex gloves. "Officer Holloway," she said, her voice gentle but professional, "the dog is in critical condition. She's severely malnourished. I can count every rib. There's significant frostbite on her paws and ears." She paused, her expression darkening. "And there are older injuries, too. Scars that suggest this isn't the first time she's been mistreated." Ben's jaw clenched. "But she'll make it, right? We're doing everything we can. The next few hours will be crucial." Dr. Collins glanced back at the treatment room. "You don't have to stay, officer. We can call you if there's any change." Ben shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving." He couldn't explain why, even to himself, but the thought of walking away made his chest tight. "I'll wait." Dr. Collins nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'll update you as soon as I can." After she disappeared back through the door, Ben dropped heavily into one of the plastic chairs. The empty waiting room felt too big, too quiet. The walls were a sterile white, decorated with posters about heartworm prevention and proper pet nutrition. He stared at them without really seeing them, his mind replaying the moment he'd found Daisy. The way she'd looked at him. Those brown eyes full of pain, but still somehow trusting. The feel of her ribs under his hands as he'd lifted her. The way she'd whimpered softly when he wrapped her in his coat. It had hit him harder than any case he'd worked in years. Ben ran his hands through his hair, surprised to find them shaking. He wasn't usually like this. He prided himself on staying detached, professional. But something about this dog, about finding her abandoned and left to die. His throat felt tight. He knew what abandonment felt like. The foster homes, the constant moving, never knowing if the next place would be better or worse. His father walking away without a backward glance when Ben was just 6 years old. The minutes crawled by. Ben alternated between pacing and sitting, checking his phone even though he knew no one would be calling. At midnight, Dr. Collins came out again, looking tired but less grim. "She's stable," she said, and Ben felt his shoulders relax for the first time in hours. "We've got her on fluids and antibiotics. The frostbite is severe, especially on her back paws. She'll need time to heal, and there might be some tissue damage we'll have to address later." "But she'll live." Ben's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Yes, I think she will." Dr. Collins smiled slightly. "She's a fighter, that one. Would you like to see her?" Ben nodded, following Dr. Collins through the treatment room door. Daisy lay on a metal table, wrapped in warm blankets. 4 lines ran into her leg, and monitors beeped steadily beside her. She looked small and fragile under the bright medical lights, but her chest rose and fell with steady breaths. Ben sank into a chair next to the table, exhaustion suddenly hitting him hard. His shift had ended hours ago, and he should have been home in bed. Instead, he found himself reaching out to gently touch Daisy's head, careful to avoid the areas Dr. Collins had bandaged. "I'll be monitoring her through the night," Dr. Collins said softly. "You should try to get some rest, Officer Holloway." But Ben barely heard her. He was looking at Daisy's face, at the way her whiskers twitched slightly in her sleep. Something protective and fierce welled up in his chest, catching him off guard with its intensity. He hadn't let himself care this much about anything, or anyone, in a very long time. He'd seen plenty of awful things in his years on the force. He'd learned to keep his emotions in check, to do his job and move on. But sitting there, watching Daisy's steady breathing, he knew this case was different. This one had gotten under his skin in a way he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he was ready for. Dr. Collins moved quietly around the room, checking monitors and adjusting Daisy's blankets. Ben remained in his chair, his eyes never leaving the sleeping dog, his mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. Relief that she was alive warred with anger at whoever had done this to her. And underneath it all was something deeper, more personal. A connection he couldn't quite explain, but couldn't deny either. The morning sun cast long shadows through the clinic's windows as Ben pushed through the front door. His uniform was crisp and clean, but dark circles rimmed his eyes from a night of tossing and turning. The waiting room was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the heating system and the occasional shuffle of papers at the front desk. Dr. Collins looked up from her clipboard, a small smile crossing her tired face. "Officer Holloway, I had a feeling you'd be back early." Ben ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "How is she?" "Follow me," Dr. Collins said, leading him through the swinging doors to the treatment area. The antiseptic smell was stronger here, making Ben's nose twitch. They stopped at a kennel where Daisy lay on thick blankets, her chest rising and falling steadily. "She's showing improvement," Dr. Collins explained, crouching down beside the kennel. Her body temperature has stabilized, and she's responding well to the antibiotics. The frostbite damage wasn't as severe as we initially feared. Ben knelt beside her, his heart aching at the sight of the bandages wrapped around Daisy's paws. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing seemed stronger than the night before. "We found something else, Doctor," Collins said, pulling out a small tablet. "She has a microchip. We were able to scan it this morning." She tapped the screen a few times. "Her name is Daisy, and she belonged to a woman named Sarah Lawson." Ben frowned. "Sarah Lawson? I don't recognize the name." "The address listed is on Oak Street, but—" Dr. Collins hesitated. "When we tried calling, the number was disconnected." Ben pulled out his notepad, jotting down the address. "I'll check it out. Maybe there's some connection to why Daisy was left in the woods." "There's something else, Doctor," Collins added, her voice softening. "We did a quick search, and Sarah Lawson passed away 3 months ago. There was an obituary in the local paper." Ben's jaw tightened. He looked at Daisy, wondering how she'd ended up chained to that tree. "I'll head over to the address, see what I can find out." 20 minutes later, Ben pulled up to a small house at the end of Oak Street. The winter sun did little to warm the scene before him. Dead leaves cluttered the front yard, and thick vines crawled up the weathered siding. The windows were dark, curtains drawn tight against the world outside. Ben climbed out of his patrol car, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The house had a hollow feel to it, like a shell that had been abandoned long ago. The front porch sagged slightly, wooden boards groaning under his weight as he approached the door. He tried the handle, surprised to find it unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a dim interior that smelled of dust and neglect. Ben pulled out his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the entrance. The living room was frozen in time. Furniture sat draped in white sheets like ghosts in the gloom. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight. Everything was neat, organized, as if someone had carefully prepared the house before leaving it behind. Ben moved carefully through the space, his trained eye taking in details. Bills and magazines were stacked neatly on a side table, their edges yellow with age. A teacup sat on the coffee table, a thin film of dust coating its surface. Something caught his eye, a photograph in a simple wooden frame. Ben picked it up, wiping away the dust with his thumb. The image showed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. She was holding a puppy, her face radiating pure joy. On the back of the frame, written in neat handwriting, "Rachel Summer, 1995. Rachel. The name struck a chord in Ben's memory. Dr. Collins had mentioned finding that name in a records search, though she hadn't elaborated. The silence in the house pressed in around him as he studied the photograph. There was something deeply sad about it, a captured moment of happiness that had somehow led to this empty, abandoned home. Ben set the frame down carefully, continuing his exploration. The kitchen was equally untouched, dishes still stacked in the drying rack. A calendar on the wall was frozen in time, its pages showing dates from 3 months ago. Everything felt wrong, like walking through a museum exhibit of someone's life. Upstairs, the bedrooms were locked, their doors refusing to budge under his gentle pressure. Ben didn't force them. He had seen enough. The house felt like a tomb, preserving memories that no one wanted to remember. Back in the living room, Ben stood still, letting the weight of the mystery settle over him. The photograph of Rachel seemed to watch him from the coffee table. What had happened here? Why had Daisy been left to die in the woods? The empty house offered no answers, only more questions. The sound of his radio crackling made him jump slightly in the silence. Ben took one last look around the room, his eyes lingering on the photograph. Something had gone terribly wrong in this house, and somehow Daisy was connected to it all. The abandoned home held its secrets close, but Ben was determined to uncover the truth, one piece at a time. Ben sat at his desk in the police station, the harsh fluorescent lights casting a cold glow over the scattered papers before him. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as he dove deeper into the records. The gentle hum of computers and distant office chatter faded into background noise as he focused on the screen in front of him. "This can't be right," he muttered, scrolling through the death records from the past month. Sarah Lawson's death certificate was there, but the details were sparse. Found deceased in her home, natural causes suspected, no next of kin listed, no mention of Rachel anywhere. Officer Martinez walked past, pausing at Ben's desk. "You look like you're solving a murder case, Holloway. What's got you so focused?" Ben rubbed his tired eyes. "Sarah Lawson died 3 weeks ago. Something's not adding up." "The old lady who lived alone? What about her?" "Her dog was found chained to a tree in the woods yesterday, nearly frozen to death." Ben pulled up another document. "But according to this, Sarah died weeks ago. Who chained the dog out there? And why isn't there any mention of her daughter Rachel?" Martinez shrugged. "Didn't know she had a daughter." Ben clicked through more files, his frown deepening. Birth records, school records, property records. Rachel Lawson was like a ghost. The only proof she existed was that old photograph he'd found in Sarah's house. He picked up his phone and dialed the local library. "Yes, this is Officer Holloway. I'm looking for Margaret Wilson, your town historian." "Yes, I'll hold." While waiting, Ben pulled up Sarah's utility records. Regular payments until her death, then nothing. No unusual activity, no red flags. Just a quiet life that ended quietly, too quietly. "Officer Holloway?" A warm, elderly voice came through the phone. "This is Margaret Wilson. How can I help you?" "Mrs. Wilson, I'm looking into Sarah Lawson's background. Anything you can tell me about her?" There was a pause on the line. "Sarah? Yes, poor thing. She became quite a recluse in her later years. Used to be active in the community, always at church events, bake sales. Then something changed. Oh, must have been 15 years ago." Ben leaned forward, his pen poised over his notepad. "What happened?" "She just withdrew. Stopped coming to events. Wouldn't answer her door for carolers during Christmas. Some folks tried to check on her, but she just waved them away through the window. Said she was fine, just wanted to be left alone." "And her daughter?" "Rachel?" Another pause, longer this time. "I remember there was a girl, yes. But she disappeared from town around the same time Sarah started isolating herself. Nobody really knew what happened. You know how people talk. Some said she ran away. Others thought she'd gone to live with relatives. Sarah never spoke about it." Ben's pen tapped against the desk. "So nobody checked on Sarah, even when she died." "It was the mail carrier who noticed the mail piling up. Called it in. Such a sad way to go, all alone like that." Margaret's voice softened. "Is something wrong, officer?" Ben thought about Daisy, lying in the veterinary clinic, abandoned and left to die. "I'm not sure yet, Mrs. Wilson. Thank you for your help." After hanging up, Ben stared at his computer screen. The cursor blinked steadily, like a metronome counting the beats of this growing mystery. Sarah's death certificate showed no signs of foul play, but something felt wrong. The timeline didn't make sense. If Sarah died weeks ago, who had Daisy? Who left her in the woods? He pulled up property records again, searching for any connection between Sarah and other locations. Tax records, utility bills, bank statements, everything painted the picture of a woman who barely existed outside her home. No social media presence, no credit card activity, just the basic paperwork of a life lived in isolation. The mystery of Rachel gnawed at him. A daughter who vanished 15 years ago, right when her mother became a recluse. The timing couldn't be coincidental, but without any official records of Rachel, how could he track her down? Ben opened a new search window, typing in variations of Rachel Lawson. Hundreds of results populated the screen, none of them matching the girl in the photograph. He tried cross-referencing with local high school yearbooks from that era, but came up empty. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk as he sat back, running his hands through his hair in frustration. The pieces were there, but they wouldn't fit together. Sarah's lonely death, Rachel's disappearance, Daisy's abandonment. Each thread led to more questions instead of answers. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Collins. Daisy's doing better today. Ate a little food. Ben looked at the message, thinking about the frightened dog he'd found in the woods. Whatever happened in that house, whatever secrets Sarah took to her grave, Daisy was an innocent victim. And somewhere out there, Rachel might be too. He turned back to his computer, determination setting his jaw. The truth was buried in these records somewhere. He just had to keep digging. Ben's fingers drummed against his desk as he stared at the computer screen, his eyes burning from hours of searching through databases. The station had grown quiet, most officers having left for the day. Only the soft whir of the heating system and occasional clicks from his keyboard broke the silence. Rachel Carter, he whispered, reading the name again. The records showed she'd changed it from Lawson years ago, right after moving 3 states away. No social media presence, no recent photographs, just a string of addresses and a current phone number. He glanced at the clock, 9:47 p.m. Late, but not too late to make a call. His hand hovered over his phone, hesitating. Something about this case pulled at him, like a splinter under his skin that he couldn't ignore. The image of Daisy, half frozen and abandoned in those woods, flashed through his mind again. Ben picked up his phone, his fingers slightly trembling as he dialed the number. Each ring seemed to stretch for an eternity. Just as he thought it would go to voicemail, a voice answered, sharp, clipped, and cold as the winter wind outside. Hello? Ben cleared his throat. Is this Rachel Lawson? Who's asking? The voice had an edge to it, like a door already beginning to close. This is Officer Ben Holloway from the Cedar Grove Police Department. He tried to keep his voice professional, steady. I'm calling about Sarah Lawson. Stop. The word cut through the line like a knife. I know who Sarah Lawson is. What I don't know is why you're calling me about her. Ben leaned forward in his chair, pressing the phone closer to his ear. Miss Carter, I found a German Shepherd named Daisy, chained to a tree in the woods near your mother's property. The dog nearly died from exposure. I've been trying to piece together what happened. I don't care about this. Rachel's voice was like ice. She's not my mother anymore. I don't want anything to do with her, or with that dog. Goodbye. The line went dead. Ben sat there, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone. The abruptness of Rachel's response left him feeling like he'd been slapped. He slowly lowered the phone to his desk, his mind racing. The venom in Rachel's voice when she spoke about her mother wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something that spoke of old wounds and unhealed scars. Ben knew that kind of pain. He'd heard it in his own voice when people asked about his father. He stared at Rachel's contact information on his screen. The daughter of a recently deceased woman had just explicitly stated she wanted nothing to do with her mother or the family dog. Most people would at least ask if their mother was okay, would show some basic human curiosity. But Rachel's response had been immediate and absolute rejection. Ben pulled up Sarah Lawson's death certificate again, studying it with new eyes. Found deceased in her home, no signs of foul play, natural causes suspected, no next of kin listed. He thought about the abandoned house, the dust-covered furniture, the photograph of young Rachel, a moment frozen in time before whatever happened to tear this family apart. The mystery had just grown deeper. What could make a daughter cut ties so completely with her mother? And who had chained Daisy in those woods after Sarah's death? The dog's microchip clearly linked her to Sarah, but the timeline didn't add up. If Sarah had died weeks ago, who had been caring for Daisy until recently? Ben rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over him. The case was becoming more complex with each new piece of information, and Rachel's hostile reaction only confirmed his suspicions that there was more to this story than a simple case of animal abandonment. He looked at his notepad where he'd scribbled down Rachel's tone and exact words. Her reaction had been too strong, too immediate. Whatever had happened between mother and daughter had left deep scars, the kind that don't heal with time. The office had grown completely silent now, the last of his colleagues having left for the night. Ben sat in the pool of light from his desk lamp, surrounded by the shadows of unanswered questions. Rachel's words echoed in his mind. "She's not my mother anymore." The harshness of those words, the finality in her voice, it spoke of a story he needed to uncover. Not just for Daisy's sake anymore, but because something told him this case was about more than just an abandoned dog. It was about broken families, buried secrets, and wounds that ran far deeper than he'd initially imagined. Ben gathered his notes, his mind already forming a plan for his next steps. Rachel's reaction had only strengthened his resolve to get to the bottom of this mystery. Something had happened in that house. Something that had driven a daughter away and left a dog chained in the woods to die. And he was going to find out what it was. Ben sat in his car, the phone call with Rachel still echoing in his mind. Her voice had been cold, almost hostile. But beneath that anger, he'd sensed something else. Pain, raw and deep. As a cop, he'd learned to read people, and Rachel's reaction told him there was more to this story than a simple family estrangement. He pulled up to Sarah's old neighborhood, a quiet street lined with well-maintained homes that stood in stark contrast to Sarah's neglected property. The winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered lawns, and Ben's boots crunched in the fresh powder as he made his way to the house next door. The doorbell chimed, and after a moment, an elderly man opened the door. He wore thick glasses and a worn cardigan, his weathered face creasing with curiosity as he looked at Ben. "Can I help you?" the man asked, adjusting his glasses. Ben showed his badge. "Officer Ben Holloway. I'm looking into a matter concerning Sarah Lawson. Did you know her?" The old man's expression softened with recognition. "Sarah? Yes, lived next door for decades." He paused, considering his words carefully. "Though I can't say I knew her well, especially in recent years. Would you like to come in? It's cold out there." Ben nodded gratefully and stepped inside. The house was warm and smelled of coffee. The elderly man introduced himself as Harold Matthews and led Ben to a small sitting room. "What can you tell me about Sarah?" Ben asked, taking out his notepad. "Or her daughter, Rachel?" Harold settled into his armchair, his eyes distant with memory. "Sarah wasn't always a recluse, you know. Years ago, she used to be quite different, always tending her garden, waving hello. But something changed." He shook his head slowly. "Started keeping to herself more and more. Rachel. Well, I haven't seen that girl in years. Sarah would mention her sometimes, but always with this look in her eyes, like she was carrying something heavy." Ben leaned forward. Did she ever say what happened between them? No, never directly, but you could tell it ate at her. Sometimes I'd see her sitting on her porch, just staring at nothing. She'd talk about Rachel like she was still that little girl who used to play in the yard. But there was always this sadness, this regret in her voice. Ben thanked Harold and spent the next hour knocking on other doors in the neighborhood. The stories were all similar. Sarah had become increasingly isolated, barely leaving her house in recent years. Some neighbors remembered bringing her groceries occasionally, but she rarely opened the door. Rachel was just a memory to them, a ghost from the past that Sarah sometimes mentioned in passing. Frustrated by the lack of concrete information, Ben decided to take one more look at Sarah's house. The key from the station felt cold in his hand as he unlocked the front door. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with neglect. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating years of accumulated dust. As he swept the light across the ceiling, something caught his eye: a pull-down attic door. Following his instinct, Ben carefully lowered the ladder and climbed up. The attic was cramped and musty, filled with forgotten belongings covered in thick layers of dust. But there, in a corner partially hidden behind some old boxes, sat an old trunk. Ben's heart quickened as he approached it. The trunk was solid wood, its brass fittings tarnished with age. A small lock held it shut, but years of exposure had left it brittle. With careful pressure from his multi-tool, the lock gave way with a soft click. The lid creaked as he lifted it, revealing a treasure trove of memories. Letters tied with faded ribbons, old report cards, childhood drawings signed in crayon. Ben's hands trembled slightly as he lifted out a stack of photographs. The first few showed Sarah as a young woman, vibrant and smiling. Then he found it, a photograph that made him catch his breath. Sarah and Rachel stood in front of the house, both beaming at the camera. Rachel couldn't have been more than 12, her arms wrapped around her mother's waist. The house behind them was well maintained, with flowering bushes and fresh paint, a stark contrast to its current state. Ben studied the photograph carefully. The joy in their faces seemed genuine, making the current situation even more perplexing. What had happened to transform that loving relationship into something so broken that Rachel would refuse to even discuss her mother? He continued sorting through the trunk's contents, finding more photos, school awards, and what appeared to be Rachel's childhood diary. Each item seemed to tell a piece of a story of a normal, happy family that had somehow shattered. The photograph of Rachel and Sarah lay heavy in his hands as he sat back on his heels. The smiling faces stared up at him, a frozen moment of happiness that had long since disappeared. Something had gone terribly wrong in this house, something that had driven Rachel away and left Sarah alone with her regrets. Ben knew he was getting closer to understanding, but the truth still felt just out of reach. The trunk's contents painted a picture of before, but the crucial piece, what had happened to destroy this family, remained elusive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the veterinary clinic as Ben pulled up in his patrol car. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of Daisy and the mysterious circumstances surrounding her abandonment. The clinic's automatic doors whooshed open, bringing a rush of warm air that carried the familiar antiseptic smell. The receptionist looked up from her computer, offering a gentle smile. "Officer Holloway, good morning. I was hoping you'd stop by." Ben's heart skipped a beat. "How is she?" "Daisy made it through the night," the receptionist said, her voice warm with encouragement. "She's stable now. Dr. Collins said she's showing good signs of improvement, though she's still weak." Ben let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His shoulders relaxed slightly, though the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on him. "Can I see her?" he asked. The receptionist nodded and buzzed him through to the treatment area. Dr. Collins met him in the hallway, clipboard in hand. "She's doing better than we expected, given her condition last night," she explained as they walked. "The frostbite wasn't as severe as we initially feared, though she'll need time to heal completely." They stopped at a kennel where Daisy lay on a thick blanket, various tubes and monitors attached to her. When she saw Ben, her tail gave a weak thump against the blanket. The simple gesture made Ben's throat tight with emotion. "What happens to her now?" he asked, kneeling down to get closer to Daisy's level. Her brown eyes, though tired, held a spark of life that hadn't been there the night before. Dr. Collins consulted her clipboard. "Well, she'll need continued care and monitoring. Normally, we'd contact animal services, but given the circumstances—" "I'll take her," Ben said, surprising himself with how quickly the words came out. "I mean, if that's possible, just until we figure out what happened to her owner." Dr. Collins smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. She seems to have formed a bond with you already. Let me get the paperwork started and give you instructions for her care." An hour later, Ben carefully helped Daisy into his car. She moved slowly, still weak from her ordeal, but managed to settle into the back seat where Ben had laid out some blankets. The drive home was quiet, with Ben frequently checking his rearview mirror to make sure Daisy was okay. His house felt different when he opened the door with Daisy at his side. The empty rooms that had never bothered him before suddenly seemed stark and lonely. He'd never really noticed how quiet it was, how the silence echoed off the bare walls. He'd always told himself he preferred it this way. No attachments, no complications. Ben helped Daisy settle onto a soft bed he'd prepared in the living room, close to the heating vent. She looked around the unfamiliar space with cautious eyes, her body tense despite her exhaustion. "It's okay," Ben said softly, sitting down beside her. "You're safe here." As the afternoon wore on, Ben found himself talking to Daisy more and more. At first, it was just gentle reassurances when she seemed nervous, but gradually he started sharing more. It felt natural somehow, talking to this creature who asked nothing of him, but seemed to understand everything. "You know, you're not the only one who's been left behind," he said quietly, watching as Daisy lifted her head to look at him. Her eyes held no judgment, no expectations, just a quiet acceptance that made something inside Ben's chest ache. Daisy responded with a soft whimper, slowly dragging herself closer until she could rest her head on his lap. The simple gesture of trust brought unexpected tears to Ben's eyes. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had been this vulnerable with him, or he with them. His hand automatically moved to stroke her fur, and memories he usually kept locked away began to surface. The day his father walked out, leaving nothing but an empty house and a mountain of unpaid bills. The parade of foster homes, some better than others, but none that ever felt like home. The walls he'd built around himself, year after year, until pushing people away became second nature. "I guess we're both a little broken," he murmured to Daisy, who responded by pressing her head more firmly against his leg. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe being broken is what helps us understand each other." The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Ben hadn't moved from his spot beside Daisy, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this fragile peace they'd found. She had drifted off to sleep, her breathing steady and calm, trusting him completely to keep her safe. Looking down at her sleeping form, Ben felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about solving a mystery anymore. This wasn't just another case to be filed away and forgotten. Daisy had somehow worked her way past all his carefully constructed defenses, touching something in him he thought he'd buried long ago: the need to connect, to protect, to care. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Ben watched Daisy sleep. The steady rise and fall of her chest, a reminder of how close she'd come to death. He'd made a decision that would change everything, though he didn't fully understand how yet. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away from this, from her, until he uncovered the truth about what had happened. The first rays of the morning sunlight were just beginning to filter through Ben's bedroom window when he heard it, a soft, desperate whimpering coming from the living room. He sat up quickly, his heart racing as he listened to Daisy's distressed sounds. Ben hurried down the hallway, his bare feet padding quietly against the wooden floor. In the dim light, he could see Daisy twitching on her bed in the corner, her legs jerking as if she were trying to run. Small, frightened whines escaped her throat as she fought against whatever demons haunted her dreams. "Hey, girl," Ben said softly, approaching slowly. "It's okay. You're safe now." As he reached out to gentle touch her, Daisy's eyes flew open. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall, her whole body trembling. The fear in her eyes struck Ben like a physical blow. She looked at him as if expecting punishment, her tail tucked tightly against her body. "Oh, Daisy," Ben whispered, his throat tight. He sat down on the floor, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. "What happened to you?" The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the scars on Daisy's body. Not just the recent wounds from the chain and frostbite, but older marks that told a story of long-term abuse. Ben had seen similar cases in his work as a police officer, but this felt different, more personal. Each scar on Daisy's body seemed to mirror the invisible ones he carried in his own heart. He stayed there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, speaking in soft, gentle tones until Daisy's trembling began to subside. When he got up to make coffee, the sound of his footsteps made her flinch. The coffee maker's sudden gurgling sent her scrambling under the dining room table, eyes wide with terror. Ben's chest ached as he watched her reactions. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, not in dogs, but in children. Children who had been hurt, abandoned, betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect them. He knew that kind of pain, intimately. Setting his coffee mug on the floor, Ben sat down near Daisy's hiding spot, making sure to leave plenty of space between them. "You know," he said quietly, "I understand being scared. Being hurt by people who should have cared for you." Daisy's ears twitched slightly, her eyes fixed on him. "My dad left when I was 6, Ben continued, surprising himself with the words that came tumbling out. "Just walked out one day and never came back. My mom, she couldn't handle it. Ended up in the system." He took a shaky breath. "Foster homes, one after another. Some good, some not so good." As he spoke, he noticed Daisy's posture changing slightly. Her ears perked forward and her body relaxed just a fraction. "I learned pretty quick not to trust anyone," Ben admitted, staring into his coffee. "Figured if I didn't let anyone close, they couldn't hurt me. Worked pretty well, actually, until now." He glanced at Daisy. "Until you." To his surprise, Daisy had inched slightly closer, her nose twitching as she studied him. There was something in her eyes, a recognition perhaps of a kindred spirit. "I got angry," Ben continued, his voice rough with emotion. "So angry at my dad, at the system, at everyone. Carried that anger around like armor. Thought it would protect me, you know." He laughed softly, without humor. "All it did was make me lonely." Daisy had moved closer still, close enough that Ben could see the different shades of brown in her eyes. She was still cautious, still ready to bolt at any sudden movement. But something in his words seemed to reach her. "I became a cop thinking I could protect others from going through what I did," he said. "But I never let myself get close to anyone. Never let anyone see the real me. He looked at Daisy, who was now just a few feet away. Funny how it takes a dog to make me finally open up. As if understanding, Daisy took another tentative step forward, then another. Finally, she was close enough to stretch her neck out and sniff Ben's hand. Her whiskers tickled his skin, and he remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. After a long moment, Daisy lowered herself to the floor beside him, not touching, but close enough that Ben could feel the warmth of her body. They sat there together in the morning quiet, two wounded souls finding comfort in each other's presence. Ben felt something shift inside him, like a wall crumbling. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel alone. Here, sitting on his living room floor with a traumatized dog, he felt understood in a way he never had before. The silence between them was comfortable, healing. Daisy's breathing had steadied, and though she still startled at occasional noises from outside, she stayed by Ben's side. Her trust, fragile as it was, felt like a precious gift. Ben looked down at Daisy, seeing his own pain reflected in her eyes. They were both survivors, both carrying scars that ran deeper than the surface. But maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. Ben sat on his couch, watching Daisy slowly eat her breakfast. Her movements were still cautious, but she was getting stronger each day. The morning light cast long shadows across the living room as he pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over Rachel's number. The memory of her cold dismissal from their first call still stung, but something in her voice had haunted him, a pain that felt familiar. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He was about to hang up when he heard a click. "Hello?" Rachel's voice was quiet, guarded. "Rachel? This is Officer Holloway again." Ben kept his voice gentle, professional. "I know you don't want to talk about this, but what do you want from me?" The words came out sharp, but beneath the anger, Ben caught something else. Fear, maybe, or exhaustion. Ben watched as Daisy lifted her head, ears perking at the sound of his voice. "I want to understand what happened. What drove you away from your mother? Why was Daisy left in the woods?" The silence that followed was heavy. Ben could hear Rachel's breathing on the other end, slightly uneven. He waited, giving her space to process his questions. "You don't know anything," Rachel finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what it was like." "Then help me understand," Ben urged softly. "Daisy's here with me now. She's recovering, but she has scars. Old ones, and not just physical ones." Another long pause. Ben could almost feel Rachel's internal struggle through the phone. "I can't go back." Her voice cracked slightly. "Not to her. Not to what she let happen." Ben leaned forward, something in her tone making his police instincts kick in. "What did she let happen, Rachel?" "You don't understand." Rachel's voice trembled. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I had to. It wasn't safe anymore." The words hit Ben like a physical blow. He looked at Daisy, who had moved closer to him, sensing his tension. The dog's eyes, still carrying their own trauma, seemed to reflect something he was beginning to understand about Rachel's past. "Rachel," he said carefully, "I think I'm starting to understand. But I need you to help me piece this together. Daisy was found chained to a tree, left to die. She has old scars that suggest long-term abuse. And now you're telling me you had to leave because it wasn't safe." "I can't." Rachel's voice was thick with unshed tears. "I can't talk about this. You don't know what it's like to live with these memories." "Actually," Ben said quietly, "I might understand better than you think. He paused, struggling with his own vulnerability. I grew up in the foster system. I know what it's like to feel unsafe in your own home. The admission hung in the air between them. Ben heard Rachel take a shaky breath. She just stood there, Rachel whispered. She watched it all happen and did nothing. And now she's gone. And I'm supposed to what? Feel sad? Come back and pretend everything's okay? Ben felt his chest tighten at the pain in her voice. Daisy had moved to rest her head on his knee, and he absently stroked her ears. No one's asking you to pretend anything, Rachel. But there are pieces of this story that don't add up. Daisy needs help, and I think maybe you do too. I got help, Rachel said firmly. I got myself out. I built a new life. I can't go back to that house, to those memories. You don't have to go back, Ben assured her. But maybe we could meet somewhere neutral. Talk face to face. There might be things you need to know about what happened to your mother, about Daisy. The silence stretched out again, but this time it felt different, less defensive, more contemplative. I'll think about it, Rachel finally said. That's all I can promise right now. That's fair, Ben replied. I'll leave you my direct number. Call me if you change your mind. After hanging up, Ben sat back on the couch, his mind racing with this new information. The pieces were starting to form a darker picture than he'd initially imagined. This wasn't just about a daughter abandoning her mother or a dog being left in the woods. There were deeper wounds here, old scars that hadn't healed. Daisy whined softly, pressing closer to his side. Ben looked down at her, seeing the trust that had slowly begun to build in her eyes. Despite everything she'd been through, she was learning to trust again. He hoped, for Rachel's sake, that she might find the same courage. The morning sun had fully risen now, filling the room with warm light. Ben sat there with Daisy, both of them carrying their own wounds, both of them somehow finding comfort in each other's presence. He knew there was more to uncover, more pain to understand. But for now, this moment of quiet understanding was enough. Ben stared at his phone on the kitchen table, Rachel's words echoing in his mind. It wasn't safe anymore. The morning sunlight streamed through his kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn surface. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten during their brief conversation. Daisy lay in the corner on her new bed, her eyes following his every movement. She seemed stronger now, though the scars of her ordeal were still visible beneath her slowly recovering coat. When Ben shifted in his chair, she lifted her head, ears perking up slightly. "What do you think, girl?" Ben asked softly. "Should we go find out what really happened?" Daisy's tail gave a gentle thump against her bed, and something in Ben's chest tightened. He couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel's story was somehow intertwined with Daisy's fate, and maybe even with his own past. Standing up, Ben grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. "Come on, Daisy, we're going on a little road trip." He gathered some supplies, food and water for both of them, Daisy's new leash, and a few blankets to make her comfortable in the car. His hands moved automatically as his mind raced through possibilities. What could have been so terrible that Rachel had to run? And why had Sarah kept Daisy, only to abandon her in those woods? Daisy followed him around the house as he packed, staying closer than usual. Maybe she sensed his determination, or perhaps she was just afraid of being left behind again. When Ben knelt to attach her leash, she pressed her nose against his hand, a gesture that made his throat tight with emotion. "We're in this together now," he murmured, scratching behind her ears. "No more abandonment for either of us." The drive would take several hours. Ben had looked up Rachel's address in the police database, something he probably shouldn't have done, but he was past caring about protocol now. As he loaded Daisy into the passenger seat, making sure she was comfortable on her blankets, he couldn't help but notice how different she looked from the half-frozen dog he'd found in the woods. There was life in her eyes now, though still shadowed by fear. The highway stretched before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the morning mist. Ben kept the radio low, more for background noise than entertainment. Every few minutes, he'd glance over at Daisy, who alternated between watching the passing landscape and dozing off. "You know," he said after about an hour on the road, "I understand running away from things that hurt you." He paused, surprised by his own openness. "Did it myself in a way. Joined the police force. Buried myself in work. Anything to avoid dealing with my own past." Daisy's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and Ben continued, "But sometimes running just means you're carrying your wounds with you. Maybe that's what Rachel did too." The suburbs gradually gave way to rolling countryside, then back to civilization as they approached Rachel's town. Ben's grip on the steering wheel tightened as they turned into her neighborhood. Neat houses with well-maintained lawns, children's bikes left in driveways, the picture of suburban normalcy. Rachel's house was a small ranch-style home with pale blue siding and white trim. Nothing about it suggested the darkness that seemed to lurk beneath the surface of her life. Ben parked across the street, his heart beating faster than he wanted to admit. "Wait here, girl," he said to Daisy, making sure the windows were cracked and she had water. "I'll be right back." The walk to Rachel's front door felt longer than it should have. Ben's boots seemed heavy on the concrete path, each step bringing him closer to answers he wasn't sure he was ready for. The doorbell chimed inside the house, and he heard footsteps approaching. When Rachel opened the door, her face immediately hardened. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair and eyes that carried too much weight for someone her age. She stood in the doorframe without opening it fully, her body language clearly defensive. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice tight with anger and something else. Fear, maybe? "I need to talk to you, Rachel," Ben said, keeping his voice steady. "About your mother, about Daisy." "I don't owe you anything." Rachel's hand tightened on the door, starting to push it closed. Ben moved quickly, blocking the door with his foot. "You don't owe me," he agreed, "but you owe Daisy something. Why did you leave her to die in the woods?" Rachel's face paled, then flushed with anger. "You don't know anything about it," she spat. "You have no right to come here and demand answers." "Someone left that dog chained to a tree to die," Ben pressed. "She was abused, Rachel. Beaten. Left to freeze to death. I need to understand why." "Get out." Rachel's voice shook. "Get off my property." Before Ben could respond, she slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame. He stood there, staring at the closed door, his frustration mounting even as his determination grew stronger. Through the door, he thought he heard a choked sob, but he couldn't be sure. The sound of a car door opening made him turn. Daisy had managed to nose open the passenger window enough to stick her head out, watching him with concerned eyes. Even from across the street, Ben could see her anxiety at being separated from him. He stood there for a moment longer, his hands clenched at his sides, knowing this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Rachel might have shut the door in his face, but he'd seen something in her eyes, a pain that matched Daisy's, a story that needed to be told. Ben's knuckles rapped against the wooden door, each knock echoing through the quiet suburban street. The sound was steady, determined, like his heartbeat. He could feel Rachel's presence on the other side, her silence a wall between them. But Ben had spent too many years building walls of his own to let this one stand. "Rachel?" he called out, his voice firm, but not threatening. "I'm not leaving. We both need answers." The curtain in the window twitched slightly. Ben continued knocking, the rhythm unchanging. Minutes passed, marked only by the sound of his knuckles against wood and the distant chirping of birds. Finally, the door flew open. Rachel stood there, her face flushed with anger, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her dark hair was pulled back messily, and her eyes blazed with a mixture of fury and fear. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she demanded, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't have anything to say." Ben met her gaze steadily, seeing past the anger to the pain beneath. "You owe it to your mother, to Daisy, and to yourself," he said quietly. "You owe it to the truth. If you care at all about what's right, you'll let me in." Rachel's jaw clenched, and for a moment Ben thought she might slam the door again. Instead, her shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining from her stance. Without a word, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The living room was sparsely furnished, with bare walls and minimal decoration. It felt temporary, as if Rachel had never fully settled in. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, creating a physical barrier between them as Ben stood in the center of the room. "Oh, why did you leave?" Ben asked directly, his voice gentle but firm. "Why did your mother die alone?" Rachel's breathing quickened, and she turned away, facing the window. The morning light cast shadows across her face, highlighting the tension in her features. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You couldn't possibly understand." "Then help me understand," Ben urged. "What happened in that house?" Rachel's hands trembled as she wrapped her arms tighter around herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "My father. He wasn't a good man." The words seemed to break something loose inside her. She turned back to face Ben, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "He would get angry. So angry. Over nothing. A dish left in the sink, a door closed too loudly, a wrong word at the wrong time."
Ben remained silent, giving her space to continue. Rachel's words came faster now, tumbling out as if she couldn't hold them back any longer.
"The bruises were easy to hide at first. Long sleeves, makeup. But it got worse. He'd throw things, break things. He'd hurt anything that got in his way." Her voice cracked. "Including Daisy." Ben's chest tightened as he thought of the scars on Daisy's body, the way she flinched at sudden movements. "And your mother?" he prompted gently. Rachel laughed bitterly. "She watched. She just watched. Never said a word, never tried to stop him. She'd clean up the mess afterward, put ice on the bruises, but she never stood up to him." Tears began to fall now, tracking silently down Rachel's cheeks. "I begged her to leave him, to protect me, to protect Daisy, but she was too afraid, too weak." Her voice hardened. "Or maybe she just didn't care enough." "I couldn't stay," Rachel continued, her voice breaking. "I couldn't watch her let him hurt me, and hurt Daisy too. So one night, I packed a bag and left. I was 17. Ben watched as Rachel paced the room, her movements jerky and agitated. I thought maybe if I left, she'd finally see what he was, that she'd finally leave him." She stopped, pressing her hands against her face. But she didn't. She stayed with him until he died 3 years ago. And then she just existed, alone in that house with Daisy, probably drowning in guilt and regret. "Why didn't you go back after he died?" Ben asked softly. Rachel's hands dropped to her sides, and she looked at him with eyes full of pain and anger. "Because she let it happen. All those years, she let it happen. How could I forgive that?" Her voice broke completely as she whispered, "I couldn't stay. I couldn't save her. I couldn't save Daisy. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of guilt and pain. Rachel stood there, tears streaming down her face, all her carefully constructed walls crumbling around her. Ben watched as years of buried trauma finally surfaced, understanding at last the full depth of her pain and the weight of the secrets she'd been carrying. Rachel sat on her worn leather couch, her fingers twisting together in her lap. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting shadows across her face. Her shoulders trembled as she took a deep breath, preparing to share the weight she'd carried for so many years. I thought I could get away, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. But every time I tried, I felt guilty. I thought I was betraying her. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. Mom would look at me with those sad eyes, and I'd feel like the worst daughter in the world. Ben sat quietly in an armchair across from her, his police uniform a stark reminder of why he was here. But in this moment, he wasn't Officer Holloway. He was just someone who understood what it meant to be left behind, to feel betrayed by the people who should have protected you. The worst part wasn't even the hitting, Rachel continued, her voice cracking. It was the silence afterward. Mom would just clean up, put ice on the bruises, act like nothing happened. Her hands clenched into fists. She'd make dinner like it was just another normal day. How could she do that? Ben leaned forward slightly, his presence steady and calm. Sometimes people who are broken can't see past their own pain, he said softly. It doesn't make it right, but nothing, Rachel cut in sharply. She was my mother. She was supposed to protect me. She stood up abruptly, pacing the small living room. Do you know what it's like to go to school wearing long sleeves in summer? To make up stories about falling downstairs or running into doors? Ben watched her move, noting how her arms wrapped protectively around herself, a habit formed from years of expecting pain. He recognized that defensive posture. He'd seen it in the mirror too many times. I never wanted to leave, Rachel said, stopping by the window. But it wasn't safe anymore. I couldn't stay and let him destroy me. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. But I couldn't come back either, not after everything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Ben gave her that moment, understanding that some wounds needed time to breathe when exposed to light for the first time. Tell me about Sarah now, he said gently. How do you feel about her being gone? Rachel's laugh was bitter, hollow. How am I supposed to feel? She chose him over me every single day. Every single day. She turned to face Ben, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And now she's dead. And I'm supposed to what? Forgive her? Maybe not for her, Ben suggested carefully. Maybe for yourself. Rachel recoiled as if he'd struck her. How can I forgive her for doing nothing? How can I forgive myself for running away? Her voice rose with each question. I left her there with him. I left Daisy there with them. I was so desperate to escape that I didn't think about anyone else. You were trying to survive, Ben reminded her. Sometimes that's all we can do. Survive? Rachel's voice cracked. Is that what I did? Because most days it feels like I'm still that scared little girl, waiting for the next blow to fall. She sank back onto the couch, all the fight draining out of her. I thought if I ran far enough I could forget. But you can't outrun your own memories, can you? Ben shook his head slowly. No, he admitted. But you can learn to live with them. You can choose to let them make you stronger instead of breaking you. Rachel stared at him for a long moment, then stood up abruptly. I need to think, she said, her voice tight with emotion. I need time. Ben nodded, understanding, that she'd reached her limit for now. He watched as she wrapped her arms around herself again, a gesture that spoke volumes about the walls she'd built to protect herself. Some wounds took time to heal, and he knew better than to push too hard, too fast. "I need time," she repeated, as if trying to convince herself more than him. Rachel's hands trembled as she reached into her worn leather purse, pulling out a yellowed envelope. The paper was creased from years of being folded and unfolded, its edges soft and frayed. The morning light streaming through her living room windows cast long shadows across the floor, making the moment feel almost suspended in time. "I wrote this when I left," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never sent it." She ran her finger along the sealed edge of the envelope, her nail catching on the aged paper. "Maybe it's time I read it." Ben sat quietly, his presence steady and reassuring. He watched as Rachel's fingers carefully opened the envelope, pulling out several pages covered in faded handwriting. The paper rustled softly as she unfolded it, and she took a deep, shaky breath before beginning to read. "Dear Mom," Rachel started, her voice wavering. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I've packed my bags and I'm leaving tonight. I can't stay here anymore. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "Every time he raised his hand, every time he shouted, every time he hurt me, I waited. I waited for you to step in, to protect me, to be the mother I needed. But you never did. You just stood there, silent, watching it all happen." Tears began to roll down Rachel's cheeks, but she pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Do you know what it feels like to see your own mother turn away when you're crying for help? To watch her clean up the mess afterward like nothing happened? To hear her make excuses for him over and over again?" Ben's hands tightened on the arms of his chair, his jaw clenched as he listened. Rachel's pain was raw and real, filling the room with an almost tangible heaviness. "I used to think you were afraid too," Rachel read, her voice cracking. "I told myself that's why you didn't help me. But now I know the truth. You chose him. Every single time, you chose him over me. And I can't bear to see you choose him over me anymore." She paused, taking a shuddering breath. "I'm not just leaving him, Mom. I'm leaving you too. Because your silence hurt more than his fists ever did. Your silence told me I wasn't worth protecting, that I didn't matter enough for you to stand up for me." Rachel's hands were shaking so badly now that the paper trembled visibly. "Sometimes I hate you more than I hate him. He was always cruel, but you were supposed to love me. You were supposed to protect me. Instead, you just watched as he destroyed everything good in our home." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, continuing to read. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you for that. I don't know if I can. Every time I look at you, I see all the times you could have helped, but didn't. All the times you chose to stay quiet instead of speaking up. All the times you left me alone to face him." The next words came out in a whisper. "I'm leaving, and I can't bear to see you choose him over me anymore. I hope someday you understand what you've done, what your silence cost me, what it cost us both." Rachel lowered the letter to her lap, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the words had physically exhausted her. Her face was a mixture of confusion and deep sorrow as she looked up at Ben. "I left because I thought I had to," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But now—" She shook her head, looking lost. "I don't know if I can ever forgive her. Or myself." The room fell silent, except for Rachel's uneven breathing. The morning light had shifted, casting different shadows across the floor, marking the passage of time, as Rachel sat with her revelation. Ben stood slowly, crossing the short distance between them. Without a word, he placed a gentle hand on Rachel's shoulder, offering silent support. He didn't speak. There were no words that could ease the pain of years of betrayal and neglect. Instead, he simply stood there, letting Rachel know she wasn't alone with her pain anymore. The letter lay in her lap, its pages now spotted with tears, the words she'd never sent finally spoken aloud after all these years. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was the first crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. The first step toward confronting the past she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The morning sun filtered through Ben's bedroom window, casting long shadows across the floor. He'd been awake for hours, tossing and turning, his mind replaying the emotional conversations with Rachel from the day before. Daisy lay curled up in her bed nearby, her chest rising and falling steadily in peaceful sleep. The sight of her brought a small smile to his face. She was healing, both physically and emotionally, just like all of them. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the quiet morning stillness. Ben reached for it, his heart skipping a beat when he saw Rachel's name on the screen. The message was simple but powerful. "I'm ready to talk. Let's meet." Ben sat up in bed, reading the message again. Something had shifted in Rachel. He could feel it. After years of carrying the weight of her past, she was finally ready to face it. His fingers hovered over the phone screen as he composed his reply, careful to keep his tone supportive, but not pushy. "Name the time and place," he typed back. "I'll be there." Daisy stirred in her bed, lifting her head to look at him with those soulful eyes. Ben walked over and knelt beside her, gently scratching behind her ears. "Things might be changing, girl," he whispered. "For all of us." Rachel's response came quickly. "The little corner cafe." "Das baje suba?" Ben agreed, and for the next hour, he moved through his morning routine with a sense of anticipation. He fed Daisy, made sure she was comfortable, and promised to return soon. As he grabbed his keys and jacket, he paused at the door, looking back at the German Shepherd who had somehow become the catalyst for all of this healing. The little corner cafe was quiet when Ben arrived, just a few regular customers scattered among the tables. Rachel was already there, sitting in a booth near the back, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She looked different today, less guarded, though still carrying the weight of her past in the slight slope of her shoulders. "Thank you for coming," Rachel said as Ben slid into the seat across from her. Her voice was steady, lacking the defensive edge it had held in their previous conversations. "Of course," Ben replied, keeping his tone gentle. He could see something had changed in her. There was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Rachel took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I've been thinking a lot since yesterday," she began. "About Mom, about everything that happened, about who I've become because of it all." Ben stayed quiet, giving her the space to continue. A waitress approached with a coffee pot, and he nodded his thanks as she filled his cup. "You know, I've spent so many years being angry," Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Angry at my father for what he did, angry at my mother for letting it happen, angry at myself for running away." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of letting it control my life." "That's understandable," Ben said softly. "Anger can be exhausting." Rachel nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I'm not doing this for her," she said firmly. "I'm doing it for me. I need to let go of the anger. I need to move forward." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she held herself together. "Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting," Ben offered. "It just means choosing not to let the past define your future." "I know," Rachel replied, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I've spent so long thinking that forgiving her would somehow make what happened okay. But that's not what forgiveness is about, is it? Ben shook his head. No, it's not. Forgiveness is about freeing yourself. Rachel took another sip of her coffee, her hand steadier now. When I saw Daisy that day, chained up and abandoned, I saw myself. I saw what I'd become, chained to my past, unable to move forward. She gave a weak smile. Maybe that's why I couldn't face it at first. But you're facing it now, Ben reminded her gently. Yes, Rachel said, her voice stronger. I am. And I want to do more than just face it. I want to heal from it. She paused, looking down at her hands. I want to stop running. The morning light streamed through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow across their table. Rachel smiled weakly as she finished speaking, and though pain still lingered in her eyes, there was something else there too. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of acceptance. Ben nodded, understanding the significance of this moment, knowing they were both witnessing the first real steps toward healing. The morning light streamed through Rachel's living room windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Ben stood in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Rachel sat in an old armchair by the window, her figure small and vulnerable against the backdrop of the bright day outside. In her hands, she clutched the letter, the same one she'd read to him earlier, the pages now wrinkled from being handled so much. Her eyes were red and puffy, evidence of tears shed in private moments. When she looked up at Ben, he could see the weight of years of pain etched across her face. The letter trembled slightly in her hands. I've been thinking... Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. I've been holding on to this for so long. She looked down at the letter, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. I don't even know if she deserves it, but I can't keep this anger anymore. Ben moved closer, taking a seat across from her. The room felt heavy with unspoken emotions, the air thick with years of buried feelings finally rising to the surface. Sunlight caught the dust motes floating between them, making them dance like tiny stars. Here, Rachel said, extending her hand with the letter. Her fingers shook as she passed it to Ben. I tried to send it so many times. Every time I got close to the mailbox, something stopped me. Fear, maybe, or anger. I don't know anymore. Ben accepted the letter carefully, as if handling a delicate artifact. The paper was worn at the creases, evidence of countless foldings and unfoldings over the years. Rachel watched him intently as he began to read, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. It feels strange now that she's gone, Rachel continued, her voice catching. Like there's this emptiness. But this letter, it's the last piece I've been holding on to. The last bit of myself I couldn't let go of. Ben read through the words slowly, feeling the weight of each sentence. The anger and hurt jumped off the page, each word a testament to years of pain and betrayal. The letter spoke of sleepless nights, of watching doors for shadows, of a mother's silence that screamed louder than any words could have. It was raw, honest, and heartbreaking. When he finished reading, Ben looked up to meet Rachel's gaze. Her eyes were filled with unshed tears. But there was something else there, too. Determination. This is your way to move forward, Rachel, Ben said softly, holding the letter out to her. You don't need to keep this weight on you. Rachel nodded, looking down at her hands. The conflict was clear on her face, the battle between holding on and letting go playing out in her expression. I'm not ready to forgive her, she said finally, her voice stronger now. I don't think I ever will be, but I need to say goodbye. One night, Daisy collapses, sending Ben into a panic. He rushes her to Dr. Collins, who stabilizes her but warns that her condition is critical. Ben waits anxiously, realizing how much Daisy means to him. By morning, Daisy is still weak, but alive. Rachel arrives, unable to stay away, and they sit together, bonded by their shared fears. As Daisy fights for her life, Rachel confronts her past, admitting she left home out of fear and guilt. A letter from her late mother reveals long-buried regret and love, helping her take the first steps toward forgiveness. Determined to heal, Rachel visits her childhood home, deciding to transform it into a shelter for others seeking refuge, just as Daisy once needed her. Weeks later, Rachel adopts Daisy, fully embracing a new chapter. She and Ben grow closer, supporting each other in their healing. With Daisy thriving, Rachel realizes she's no longer just surviving, she's truly living. In a home now filled with warmth, laughter, and trust, she, Ben, and Daisy become an unlikely yet unbreakable family. If you enjoyed the story of Ben, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.